I started this channel in 2023 as a tool to spread knowledge and hopefully raise awareness on different topics, as well as gather a community of like-minded thinkers in the long run. It is indeed a passion project. Yet what it also serves as is to keep track of predictions I occasionally make, and as I never get tired to stress, most often hope I'm wrong about. Today we want to briefly summarize some of these from the past, where I got it right so far, and then venture into an elaborate list of outlooks for 2026. Structured as follows: 1. Politics and diplomacy. 2. Economics. 3. Resulting convergence of crises and wars, with a special deep dive into the Russo-Ukrainian War. 4. Societies and freedom. 5th, recommendations of actions to hopefully mitigate some of these yet avoidable crises. To keep it concise, I just want to briefly summarize that, for example, regarding the developments in the Russo-Ukrainian theater, I've remained correct in points of overall advanced paces and gains, as well as that Russia overall then will gain the upper hand steadily if Western help does not increase significantly, since our episode on the failure projections of Ukraine's counteroffensives in 2023. Next up, the speculation which still got stratagems banned from Instagram, as we dared to speak about potential peace in the beforehand mentioned conflict, quoting Edward Ludwig that it might very well come to a settlement where conquered territories, especially the most direly Russian-claimed oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk and Crimea, might go to Russia, with the Trump administration seeming to be willing to make regarding concessions. Last but not least, a several times mentioned projection that Israel, however, lacks in its measures to deter the October 7th attacks, and regardless how gruesome these might have been, the subsequent Israeli campaign was bound to lead Israel to lose the majority in the unfolding information war. To dive right into today's topics: 1. Politics and diplomacy. 1.1. Tensions between the US and Europe will continue to intensify in 2026, particularly over democracy and freedom of speech. 1.2. Divisions between US and NATO will deepen, with the credibility of Article 5 further falling in general perception. 1.3. The credibility and trust in the Trump administration will continue to erode, both domestically and internationally. Personal note: this as to draw from a recent conversation with a dear friend quite close to higher political circles. In my opinion, not too much has changed. It is only being done more openly and with a less diplomatically and flower-coated sort of speech and conduct. President Maduro literally told his adversary, "Come and get me," and so he did. That this was achievable without first having to invade and kill tens, hundreds of thousands, or even millions actually speaks for that the USA indeed is getting closer to the so often claimed surgical strike capability than ever before. To directly come to the biggest losers in the Venezuela regards, apart from the Venezuelan populace in the near future potentially. 1.4. Russia's dependence on China and India will increase, with limited strategic options. 1.5. China will continue to challenge the dominance of the dollar through gold, silver, and panda bonds in yuan. 1.6. The US will stay consistent in trying attempt to increase its international influence, including through the weaponization of the dollar, even against allied states. 1.7. This while China will attempt to fill the power vacuum created by more isolationist US, and as a new scramble for Africa has been unfolding for quite a while, which, for example, unbeknownst to many, sets France and Russia on an ever more escalating collision course. China especially has smartly spread its investments as well as influence on the continent, with all major players of the multipolar world trying to win over states, but especially resources, and last but not least, basic products delivering drones. More European lacking competitiveness, and for example China's way more defined and deep penetrating strategies in various strategic security concerns, will be covered in the next episode, Planless in Europe. 1.8. Speaking of, tensions between allied states will escalate. European states among themselves, European states and Ukraine. 1.9. Also, tensions between Ukraine and US will worsen after ongoing peace efforts likely are going to fail. Therefore, tensions between Trump and Zelensky will increase, possibly up to an actual US withdrawal of support. 1.10. Therefore, tensions between Trump and Zelensky will increase, possibly up to an actual US withdrawal of support. 1.11. Meanwhile, relations between the US and Russia will improve regardless of the war, including mineral and energy cooperation as well as in the Arctic. 1.12. Further on, diplomatic efforts regarding the conflict in Ukraine will have ups and downs, but most likely ultimately fail, possibly with some little ceasefires on occasion. 2. Economies. 2.1. Economic decline and strategic mismanagement, especially in Europe, will become more evident. 2.2. Over-reliance on AI stocks will introduce serious market fragility and volatility. 2.3. Europe's decades of poor decisions and managed decline will become more obvious.
The numbers don't lie. The European economy was 10 times bigger than China. Now we're equal. In 2007, we were equal with the United States. Now they're 50% in front of us. The entire difference is the tech sector. We've become totally dependent on technology that we do not own and do not control. That is not how the Chinese did it. They did it differently. We were a little bit naive, and it's time to wake up. We need our own technological platforms to build the prosperity of tomorrow. If not, Trump can do with us, he can play with us. He can make us slaves because we actually are slaves then. And we'll have to take for granted whatever he does.
2.4. This, while black or at least brownouts, will start to become more frequent and further hamper economic as well as fiscal and social stability. 2.5. Meanwhile, China will further seek to push its domestic automotive market into as many countries as possible. 2.6. Resulting from all this and the before mentioned points in section 1, there will be a movement away from fiat currencies towards gold, silver or cryptocurrencies, of which the latter come with their own concerns and personal note, their sheer environmental and actual synthesis of binding computer power instead of being deployed to solve actual problems. 2.7. Due to the worsening economic situation, European funding concerns regarding Ukraine will deepen, with possible attempts to release frozen Russian assets. Coming to Clausewitz's continuation of politics with other means. 3. Wars and crises. Separate mention for itself for the coming years, water wars. Especially the Middle East might see tensions escalate as Iran is going into a severe crisis of this resource and tensions with Afghanistan in this regard are rising. Similar crises between Ethiopia and Egypt as well as China and India might escalate. On a seemingly completely polar yet important mention, we are also running out of a vital production input to our modern world, sand from riverbeds and coasts, being used in concrete, of which a mile of highway consumes tens of thousands of tons, but also glass as well as chips are produced, which is why there is even a black market in existence, and access might become a similarly important treated issue as access to rare earths, which played a significant role in President Trump's demands in regards to Ukraine. Moving on with, and in expanding conclusion, 3.1. The US will conduct further kinetic strikes against Iran, possibly Venezuela, Syria and other areas. 3.2. There will be a significant false flag event, location and type unknown, used to justify further intervention in the Middle East or escalation in Europe around Ukraine. 3.3. There will be an increase in state-backed proxy wars in Asia, the Middle East and Africa. 3.4. Turkey will intensify its engagement in Syria, potentially move against Armenia, and also progress on its Islamic NATO with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. 3.5. Further hotspots: Horn of Africa, Myanmar, Sudan, with South Sudan nearing collapse. While for example Libya remains a battleground of different global and regional interest blocs and players, France is massively losing political ground, influence in Central and more Southern Africa to Russia and economically to China. Looking further east, Cambodia's and Thailand's unresolved claims on common heritage site and colonially disastrously defined borders might at least flare up again. 3.6. Over recent years we also saw tensions in the Balkans boil up once more. 3.7. Russo-Ukrainian War specifics. The war of attrition will reinforce and accelerate itself, with Russia increasingly gaining the upper hand. Kilometer per month gains will increase by 10 to 20%, dramatically more. There will be at least one breakthrough of 20 kilometers plus over a few days, similar to the one we saw in north of Pokrovsk. There will be a battle for a major city, possibly Zaporizhzhia or Kherson, the largest since Mariupol. Desperation will remove existing limits. Ukraine will attack more ships of the Russian Shadow Fleet. There will be further terror-style attacks, such as car bombs against commanders and politicians in Moscow. Drones will attack additional targets of the nuclear triad: radars, facilities, aircraft. There will be further Ukrainian actions outside its borders, for example in Africa, drone training for forces opposing Russian interests. Russia, on the other hand, will intensify its grey zone warfare in Europe: factory fires, airspace violations, damaged internet cables. Also, there will be further false flags, likely against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And last but not least, Russia will attempt to isolate Odessa through attacks on bridges and port facilities. Last off, European NATO elements will keep struggling to mount a coherent, well-synchronized force, covering the whole combined arms spectrum in a similarly functioning way as the single nation-state's biggest players. While French exercises recently showed Russia that further blitz campaigns might be somewhat viable, with the French needing 10 days to deploy to Romania, and Russia, for example, taking just 5 days to cross the Dnieper and take Kherson some years ago. German sources describe the current efforts as investing with a watering can, while no well-planned strategy of overall later synchronization for effect maximization exists yet. A former commander of the Polish National Forces admits the latter in even these words. More on this in February's episode, Plan Less in Europe. To also dive more into the regarding episode on generations of warfare, while the US recently announced the 7th fighter aircraft generation, partly touched on in our Generations of Warfare Basics episode, once again, as in World War II, being able to produce a greater number of simpler systems might be the scale-tipping element in more conventional attritional conflicts, as Anduril CEO Palmer Luckey notes in regards to a conflict to defend Taiwan.
The real power of the Chinese military is the ability to manufacture. They have dozens to hundreds of times more military shipbuilding capacity than we do. And as someone who's made things in China, I know how cheap things can be done over there. Not because the labor's cheap, but because the people are good, the regulations are good, the supply chain and logistics and materials are very favorable. So when I talk about China kicking our ass in a mass-on-mass conflict, I'm talking about what happens when you have the things that they're good at making versus the things that we're good at making in an actual war, not a prestige war or a marketing war. And unfortunately, right now, they are very much on the right side of the equation. They're building weapons that are sometimes better than ours for a tenth of the price and 100 times the scale. Anti-ship missiles are a huge concern, particularly ones that get into the high supersonic or low hypersonic regime where it's very hard to defend against them. And even if you can defend against one, can you defend against 10? Can you defend against 100? And when an aircraft carrier is so many billions of dollars, you can justify throwing a lot of missiles at it and it still makes a lot of sense.
Attributability, which is coming more into focus as discussed with Ukrainian Special Forces veteran Jonas Stratzenberg in a regarding interview. To get a bit far short speculative, and as briefly mentioned in our How to Defend from Drones video on Tuck and Practical, in later summarizing remarks, individual mobility as in two-wheel plays a great factor in intensive drone warfare areas of operations, which is why not on a wider scale with actual animals. While the former, of course, would be a significant logistics as well as training and sustainment effort, let alone additional suffering issue, we might at least see more like this kind of return of the Cavalry. To some it was an April Frost joke, yet I stated in full seriousness that it should be considered to return, as we now also see first example on the Ukrainian battlefield, but hopefully rather technical solutions like this will do well in actual testings. 4. Societies. 4.1. Europe will reach critical mass for the Russo-Ukrainian belief that Russia can both defeat Europe and yet only be able to slowly grind and chip away at Ukraine at the same time.
Look, what has Russia achieved in the past 4 years? It's acquired 20% of the territory of Ukraine through military warfare, roughly 2%. In the process of doing that, it has provided about 1 million casualties and dead. It has decreased its sphere of influence. You can see the Central Asian countries, you can see the Southern Caucasus detaching themselves from the Russian Empire. You look at the Russian economy right now. If we go with the inflation rates of the 2 first weeks, we're looking at 30% inflation this year. 16% interest rates, zero growth, no more reserves, incapacity to pay the soldiers when the war ends. So I'm more worried about Russia's unwillingness to end this war because they cannot afford to do so than about Russia's capability to win this war.
A deeper commentary and numbers on this in the next episode of this year in about 4 weeks. 4.2. The information space will further deteriorate, with expanding efforts to try state control over narratives and dissenting opinions. 4.3. Resulting in tightening social media controls in open or more veiled ways. 4.4. This to do with the great noticing of many populations, which will shift from awareness to anger, particularly regarding immigration, identity, and foreign influence. 4.5. Information control will continue to tighten, both by states and by individuals and groups. which is especially dangerous as we have recently seen that even Gen Z indeed remains able of toppling governments after these have been banned, as for example in Nepal. 4.6. Once larger protests arise, there will be similar false flags attacks with protesters as well as police being shot at the same time to further escalate the tensions and play into well-positioned players' hands. See the coming episode of our 5th Generation Warfare series on Strategy Academy. 5th, what to do. First off, we must realize that restrictions on freedom of speech are essentially restrictions on thought and attempts to silence concerns, and democratic participation historically have proven to only nurture further radicalization and looking for other forms of making oneself heard. In security concerns especially, that an analysis might be deemed inconvenient or not politically correct enough, worded, and then just for these reasons not to be noted nor acted, if not at the least wargamed on, is a blind spot any professional should instinctively recognize. History ever again shows us how hubris and not wanting to see can breed catastrophe. Disclaimer: I support efforts to rein in AI-generated contents as deepfakes, for example, are becoming highly dangerous, but community notes are a better and more democratic way than truth ministers. Regarding some safety measures against being taken advantage of in personalized deepfake attacks, see our regarding interview. Diving right into possible ways of action to hopefully mitigate future crises. 5.1. Countries must again learn to prioritize their own populations. What is the best for their own citizens and their prosperity? 5.2. We must return to the principles and values that build our systems. Of course with its historically unique empathy, but without the suicidal tendencies. More on this in 6 Reasons Why the World is Crazy, this summer on Stratagem's Culture. 5.3. We must stop the erosion and infection of core ideas, institutions and systems. More on this, for example, in the episode on Russian agents of influence and where to find them, or from mid of the year on in my upcoming book, 13 Lies About Reality, Part 1. 5.4. Directly drawing from several of its premises and chapter titles, as for example, Progress is inherently positive, Everything is black and white, Logical automatically means correct, The truth does not exist, and Morality may be relative, we must undertake an education reform from preschool to university. Factual truth must outweigh postmodernist ideas again. 5.5. Rollback controls in speech and expression. People need the right to say what they think, even if one disagrees and feelings might get hurt. We must once again realize that there is indeed a difference between cognitive dissonance and actual violence. 5.6. Democratic foundations must not be allowed to erode further. 5.7. Enable and allow trust in nations and legitimate pride in one's own country again. 5.8. Leaders with courage are needed to address fundamental problems, not just virtue signaling. 5.9. Immediately support the existing middle and working classes. They are the engine of the country. 5.10. We must stop further nurturing oligopolization. While vertical integration might sound efficient, it is not in regards of nurturing direly needed innovation, which should always be preferred to quotas and austerity measures to achieve certain goals. Honorable mentions: make healthy food affordable again. 5.12. Re-enable the hope of home ownership for working people. 5.13. Reduce fear of having children by ensuring security in food, housing and trust in government, as these days they are literally a poverty risk. 5.14. Stop the path to world war. No leader would go to war if they could see the many potential ends these days, if they were not used to being sheltered from results and consumed in partly double-thinking bubbles in regards of capabilities and outcomes. 5.15. Prioritize developing and enabling one's own population at home before using immigration as a solution. 5.16. Do not allow dual citizenship in regards of countries your soldiers would need special permission or report on planning to visit. As a parting note, for those who might feel especially lost, in times of difficulty, contact friends, family or professional help. The Economist itself is foretelling times of turmoil up to the collapse of the American dream. Neither purchasing power nor wages have been able to keep up with the ever-rising productivity of Western workers, while the various experiments to import workers from abroad to ease the burdens of employers have failed spectacularly on a net sum level for every Western country involved. while various networks of foreign elements as well as own elites are siphoning public funds and therefore future stability and prosperity at unknown levels since the late stages of civilizational collapse, as for example the late Roman Republic. This, while the uncontrolled and unvetted immigration experiment remains unique in human history, yet as ever more people seem to notice the difference between harmony among a diverse team of highly educated individuals, the forming and partly already deeply entrenched parallel cultures might prove a breaking point for many countries, except maybe the US, with its the others far exceeding integration capabilities. If it yet might become ever more public knowledge that this exact dream is at its end, therefore, not as a personal defense and neither as a macroeconomic forecast, President Trump's latest move of trying to ease the housing market crisis will be seen as a memorable move to tackle systemic problems. If this will save the overall economic system is yet highly doubtful, yet, as elaborated in recent videos and newsletters, as well as by many historians, the historical cycles seem to progress and the sovereign debts mounts, fiscal illusions crumble, and the AI booms begin to fail to cover all these maladies. The most powerful players will once again secure their, if not investments in shares, at least comparable positions, while the savers, working and middle class are once again to... One only can hope that the sense of sanity returns to the elites, as is elaborated in our China-Taiwan video. A population in unrest, as well as an economy in crisis, is easily translated into incentives to war. That these yet in this age cannot be constrained and controlled anymore as in centuries past, is hopefully to be realized by everyone involved. Otherwise, make it well through 2026, dear fellow human beings, so we hopefully will see each other again for a big recapitulation of all my falsified claims for this year in 2027. If you would like to learn more about potential conflicts and threats, please like the video and subscribe to this channel, as March's episode, Clueless in Europe, is on the way. If you might rather be interested in learning how to use military intelligence tool for your own benefit, including how to spot, for example, psyops and other manipulations being leveled against you, please check out Strategem Strategy Academy. Speak more to others, make sure to prepare, stay aware, take care. Thank you for your attention. This concludes my elaborations.